Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 in juvenile justice, and this week we're going to talk about juvenile crime, the criminals, and the victim. There are quite a few studies out there that show that your, excuse me, that the criminals and the victims' demographics match typically. Backgrounds typically same or similar. There's not a lot of variance between your analysis of the criminal versus your analysis of the victim. Excuse me. And it's important to understand that and what that means. When we think of crime, when we think of criminals, we oftentimes think that, person of one demographic attacks person of another demographic. This isn't true. Statistically speaking, white males attack other white males. African American males attack other African American males. Asian males attack other Asian males. The difference is when it comes to domestic violence, then you have to suspend some things because oftentimes your victim is a different gender than your offender. But not always. Domestic violence doesn't care about demographics. It doesn't care about any of those other little details. It just cares that it occurs. So it's important to keep that in mind as we delve into looking at the criminality and victimologies as it relates to juvenile offenses. Because, even though there are a lot of deliberate differences between the juvenile system and the adult system, there are still a lot of similarities as well. So when we talk about measuring juvenile crime, we look at the official records and measures, cases reported, juvenile complaints completed that were actually referred to the criminal justice or to the juvenile justice system. But we also look at victimization statistics and measures. What does that mean? Not every crime is reported. They call these the dark figures of crime. The crimes that don't get reported, that law enforcement never finds out about, that whatever system, whether it be adult or juvenile system, never hears about. The self-reported statistics and measures, the individuals who commit crimes that are never detected, or that are detected but are never, no one's ever found guilty of, or no one's even arrested for. So the self-reported statistics allow us to understand the scope and extent of certain crimes that no one may ever find out about. And then we're going to talk about a comparison of these three methods. When it comes to all of these various and sundry things, the first thing we're going to look at, like I said, is the official records. And that is not nearly as easy as it sounds, because each jurisdiction has its own records. There are only certain things that are reported federally. And so we need to take these statistics with a grain of salt. The juvenile justice system specifically is very decentralized because we want to make sure we maintain the confidentiality of the records. Again, back to, remember, harken to chapter 1, where we have these differentiations between the juvenile system and the adult system. And the big reason we have that is to ensure that we're not labeling these juveniles. We want to make sure that we're continually focused on rehabilitation and adding the stigma of a conviction, or as we use in the juvenile justice system, adjudication, can create a label and a stigma for that juvenile, and we don't want to do that. So we have a lot of confidentiality and sealing restrictions that are in place in Georgia and across the United States. So, and there are laws that state, federal laws that say that each state will keep these records confidential. A lot of people tend to think that juvenile court records are automatically sealed. This is not true. Juvenile court records are not automatically sealed. You still have to request them to be sealed. The procedure is significantly truncated from an adult attempting to get their record sealed or expunged, as the case may be. But it's important to remember that whenever we do get statistics, they're oftentimes dated, they're out of date. So those statistics, because it does take so long to compile, because it is a decentralized system, because there is no federal level to it, so it just makes it so hard to get current statistics and to make sure that those current statistics are actually accurate. So just keep that in mind when we're discussing some of those statistics. And there's some terms you need to know. The first being correlates. Now, correlates are variables that are related to each other, but do not simply imply causation. I also teach a research methods class, and I always use this particular example. And that example is ice cream consumption increases in the summer. Well, shark attacks increase in the summer. Therefore, ice cream causes shark attacks, which we all know is not true. They're simply correlates. They're related because they occur at the same time, in the same time frames. But one does not cause the other. Shark attacks don't cause ice cream consumption, and ice cream consumption does not cause shark attacks. So it's important to understand correlation is not causation. I always break it down correlated. They're correlated. You can put them together. Maybe it's through some sort of ephemeris connection, but there is at least some connection. The second thing you need to understand is risk factors. These are the variables that research has found to be correlated. Again, correlated, not causation, correlation. Correlated with delinquency. Single-parent households. Children in foster care. Children living below certain socioeconomic levels. There's various and sundry correlates that we can cite, but the reality is they're not the causation. Causation comes down to a matter of choice. But then there are also these things called protective factors. So we have risk factors, which put a juvenile at risk, right? And then you have protected factors, which these are variables that protect a child from delinquency. Overprotective parents, which I'm sure at least some of you have had an overprotective parent, and I know both mine were. And I didn't really appreciate it until I had my own children, that they were just trying to protect me, aka protective factors. So when we're talking about juvenile justice and juvenile crime, the official records are from statistics and data collected by law enforcement agencies, courts, and correctional institutions. Now, this is a little dated because law enforcement no longer uses UCR, which was the Universal Crime Report. It was governed and overseen by the FBI, and agencies would break down their cases into two different indexes. The first being, or two different categories, I'm sorry. The first being the index crime, and the second being the non-index crime. index crimes are violent crimes: rape, murder, armed robbery, robbery itself, aggravated assault, anything that is a violent felony. And then the non-index crimes are your less serious crimes, misdemeanors, but also burglary, because burglary is not considered an index crime. It's not a violent crime, but it's a property crime. So it would fall into the non-index crimes. Unfortunately, the FBI has a very difficult time collecting information on juveniles because there may not be a commensurate incident report. It may just be a petition. And if a petition, let's say it's filled out by a parent that doesn't have law enforcement contact, then it's not necessarily reported. And then juvenile courts absolutely protect their data. So, but you need to understand there's also this thing called the OJJDP, which is the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Protection or Prevention. Sorry. And that is the primary federal agency that's responsible for addressing the issues of juvenile crime and delinquency and the problem of missing and exploited children. There's something called ICAC. It's I don't remember what all of the acronym stands for, so I'm not even going to attempt part of it. But it's important to remember that this technology changes at such a rapid pace. It's kind of hard to stay ahead of it. But OJJDP collects information on juveniles, and including case level data and aggregate data from juvenile courts across the country. You know, we see this many kids for a chins level offense, or we see this many kids for an index crime. So now we need to talk about the automated case level data and aggregate data and that funnel effect. So automated case data is data that's collected by agencies at the individual case level, containing details on the offender, the victim, the disposition, and any and all other relevant terms. And yes, that is a very broad definition, but it's important to understand. So, the automated case level data, that's collected by agencies at the individual case level, and it contains the details on the offender, the victim, the disposition, and other relevant items. Whereas the aggregate data is collected by agencies on how many crimes or dispositions they processed. No individual level data is included or collected, and it's just summary statistics and counts. And then you have this funnel effect, and that's the way in which the number of cases processed through the juvenile justice system decreases at each successive step. And what that's saying is that there are steps through the system, and as you go through the system, fewer and fewer people continue to remain in the system, moving on to the next level. Most people are treated and released, or they get out of the system by their own volition, their own accord. There's a lot of different ways that can go down. And as I said before, the dark figure of crime is the phrase that's used to describe the number of crimes committed but undiscovered or unreported. And there are some victimless crimes. These are where the victim is a willing participant. One that comes to mind, statutory rape. It's not a rape of violence or sexual sadism. It's not motivated by sexual sadism either. It's merely typically a boy and a girl engaging in illicit behavior without the knowledge and consent of parents. So now we have NIBRIS, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. And This is designed to replace UCR and to address a lot of the issues. But it's about the individual level data on offenders, the victims, and the crime from police departments. Officers have to report this and upload it. So it's not perfect. There's still a lot of bugs in it right now. It's been live a couple of years. Sounds right. So we shall see. I mean, that's definitely a we shall see kind of thing. So, we've gone over the official data collection. Now we're going to talk about the victimization statistics. Again, this allows us to track that dark figure, to know what crimes were never reported. It does show a more realistic picture of the total number of crimes committed annually, and especially when it's conducted with juveniles at schools, which, if you know anything about research, you know that you're going to have to get special permission from the parents or guardians in order to interview juveniles. There's a lot that goes into that. And so those extra steps, it makes sense. But when you're conducting the victimization survey with juveniles at school, that is probably your most accurate measure of juvenile victimization and school crime. However, it is not without flaw. One of the weaknesses is that most people don't know that they were victimized by a juvenile. How many times have you seen a kid on the street and been like, there's no way they're 13. They look like they're 21. That happens. So, and especially when an individual is a victim of a crime, they tend to overestimate age, height, weight. But it's also important to know that the crime victimization survey, the National Crime Victimization Survey, the NCVS, is sent out, to households, not to juveniles. And those kids are not telling their parents. Yeah, Mom, Dad, fun fact, I robbed a liquor store. No, stop it. Or, Mom, Dad, fun fact, I vandalized a house. No, you're not. They're not telling their parents. They're not going to tell law enforcement. They're not going to tell any kind of official. So you have to think in those terms. And like I said, that's the NCVS, or the National Crime Victimization Survey. And it's done annually every year. And it's conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics. I do not recommend saying that word fast. And it does demonstrate that crime is a lot higher than UCR or NIBRS records. Well, what about the other statistics? Okay, fun fact, they're not without flaws. So, ta-da, guess what? It's not perfect either. But it does allow us to conduct trend analyses over a period of time, to compare the results, see if, what's getting better, what's not, what's continuing to degrade, what kind of programs should we implement, should we not implement any, yada, yada, yada. But it is an accurate and a reliable assessment of formal juvenile officer processing. And it does add a good measure of police activity in the Juvenile Justice Center, and allows for comparisons to be made among different jurisdictions. So let's say jurisdiction A had a 1 mile strip of homes that were getting burglarized. Well, fun fact, B1 and B2 are pictures of subdivisions that butt up to that particular area but don't overtake it, so he can't be charged with larceny or theft by conversion or anything like that. But there is when we talk about these additional statistics, there's a good measure of police activity in there, and allows for comparisons among different jurisdictions. So we can actually look at the juvenile justice results for Dallas against Atlanta, against New York, against Chicago, against Detroit. You get the idea. But the problem is a lot of these numbers are estimates, and some agencies don't report at all. And any juvenile that's processed informally or returned to their parents isn't noted. We have no record of that. And of course, most juveniles don't report crimes to police. So a lot of juvenile offenders are handled informally by police and by the courts. I can attest that there was a time, I'll never forget this. I wrote a speeding ticket to a young man, and it was just, it was more than doubling the speed limit. It was 72 and a 35. It was just ridiculous. And of course, kid grabs an attitude with me, so I have him call his parents, and I talked to a kid who for some reason thought I would mistake her voice for, I don't know whose. But I didn't forget. I didn't not come. I just had to deal with Hammerback. But it's a really poor measure of status offenses as it relates to victimization. You have got to be very careful what you do. Again, now we're going to talk about the self-report studies. These are actually our most accurate measure of offending, because a lot of juveniles don't get caught. And it does assess status offenses and victimless crimes. And the juveniles are the ones filling them out. But what it helps to do more than anything is it helps provide motivation or insight into motivation, the demographics and correlates of the juvenile crime. You know, why are they doing this? What else is going on? And it's the only measure that can actually estimate the total picture of juvenile crime. And the data can be cross-checked with other data, with your National Crime Victimization Survey, your official reports and records. So, and there's a lot of ways a lot of reasons that these self-report studies are some of the best ways. However, again, just like everything else, there are weaknesses. I tend to prefer to call them challenges, but anyway, kids don't always have the best memory. They can exaggerate and straight up lie. And they can exclude certain juveniles, like chronic offenders or ones that are incarcerated. And the manner that the questions are asked can bias the survey. You have to be really, really careful how you word a question, because you can sit there going, is this asking this or is this asking this? I don't know. And the juveniles can just flat out misinterpret. But we saw a peak in juvenile crime in the 1990s, the mid-90s, and that sparked the get tough on crime era for juveniles, because we actually saw a huge spike in juvenile violent crime, shootings, stabbings, murders, etc. et al. And so we've since seen a steady declination over the years, and it's important to understand that overall we've seen a decline in crime over the years. The last few years, of course, have been an anomaly. We had 2020, which that whole year was just an anomaly. But there's a lot of reasons why people think that juvenile crime has continued to go down. Part of it is that get tough on crime mentality that inhabited the 90s, that inspired juveniles to not commit crimes. Okay. And possibly. And society's changed its values. Drugs are no longer a horrible thing, right? We've seen the decriminalization at minimum of marijuana. And we've also seen a lot of emphasis on community policing and community justice. And of course, that's one of the explanations proffered for the reduction of juvenile crime. The regression to the mean, which is a statistical saying, the increased capacity to deal with juvenile offenders or the incapacitation effect, meaning we have more places to put them and lock them away. Now we're going to move on and talk about some of those risk factors and protective factors. Remember, the risk factors are variables which put juveniles at risk, whereas protective factors are factors that protect them from criminality. And you have this thing called the cumulative effect, which is the total result of combined risk factors. And then engaging in those risky behaviors or lifestyles typically leads to certain outcomes and opportunities or lack thereof. Skipping school means bad grades, means less educational opportunities. And studies have shown that education is the number one resiliency against criminality. So, just some things to think about. Now, we're going to break these down into biological, family, personality, and social environment, and ecological factors. And lastly, we'll touch on education. I'm not going to read through all of these. I'm going to hit some highlights, though, some things that I think it's important that you understand and recognize. Some of the risk factors, like being male. Being male is a risk factor for criminality. A low IQ, congenital defect, chronic pain. Parents are substance abusers. They have an acquired physical handicap. Mother used drugs or alcohol during the pregnancy. Some protective factors. Being female. Being female is a protective factor. Being the firstborn. Not having the congenital defects, that handicaps, no chemical dependence, familial history, and a high IQ. High IQ, shocker. But I sometimes tend to wonder about that. Anyway, some of your family, the familial risk and protective factors. Again, substance abuse by parents, parental rejection, low presence of parents as their social resource, low monitoring, discipline, or supervision. When the juvenile doesn't spend a lot of time at home. If the mom got pregnant again before the youth was 2 years old. What about the parent's criminality? If a parent commits crime, the children are at higher risk to do that. When there's poor communication, a mom's away working when the child is home. Friends engage in problematic behavior. There's a history of familial illiteracy. An elder sibling left the home or is a runaway. There's low religiosity. Religion actually is one of the biggest protective factors in a family. And physical abuse. Being a victim of physical abuse, of course, is a severe risk factor. Some of your protective factors, again, no chemical dependence history, a lot of attention from mom in that first year. They view the parent as a great resource. There's 4 or fewer children in the home. Again, greater than 2-year gap between siblings. Has great conversations, a lot of communication with her parent. Kid goes out for fun and recreation 3 or less times per week. There's positive parent-child relationship. There's a lot of parental guidance, discipline, and rule enforcement. There's a familial direction and power. And there are some very coherent and cohesive family values that are shared and accepted by the children. The family values education, or other family members have attended college. That's why I make a kind of a big deal about being a first-gen college graduate. And I'm also the first with a graduate degree and the first with a PhD. And I kind of make a big deal about that because I understand how important that example is for my children. I have 2 sons, and my boys will actually be the first male college graduates in my family. After, if they graduate before my husband does. But my husband will actually be the first male, and he'll be the first college graduate in his family. So what are some of the personality risks? If they feel stressed all the time, they're shy, especially when combined with hostility. They're very dependent. When they have depression or anxiety, they lack the ability to conform. Low self-esteem, they're impulsive, low ability to show empathy, low global concern. They have a lack of discipline. They're sexually promiscuous. They place a high importance on hedonistic values. Suicidal ideations, antisocial personality disorder, easy and frequent lying, or they're learning disabled. Now, some of those protective factors, they have good coping skills, they're responsible, they have good social skills, they think independently, they have this general sense of well-being, they have this internal locus of control, meaning they have good self-control. They communicate well, they have a positive view of the future, they value sexual restraint, they have a strong belief in religion, they care about people's attitudes, they're empathetic and compassionate, verbal skills, good decision-making skills, good friendship-making skills. They have achievement via independence. Basically, the opposite of the risk factors are their protective factors. So the social environment, when their friends engage in problem behavior. Yeah, and I used this quote just the other day in a class. It's hard. There's a saying that says it's hard to fly like an eagle when you're surrounded by turkeys. And I say that, be careful your friends are, because your friends do matter. It does make a difference. Having bad friends is a risk factor. Having good friends is a protective factor. Um, when they're drug free, they don't possess or use guns. Um, when kids hang out with other kids who, engage in substance abuse, who are engaged in violent acts. When they have friends who have sexually transmitted diseases. And again, that socioeconomic factor, underclass, economic hardship, stressful life events, a persistent high level of poverty in the home. Those are all risk factors. Just being upper to upper middle class are protective factors. When free time is unstructured, or there's little interest or time spent in religious activities, that's a risk factor. Being involved in extracurricular activities and involved in religion, involved in music, are all protective factors. Now, the ecological, are there any community sports that they can engage in? They have easy access to firearms or drugs, or do they not? Is there a strong neighborhood cohesion? They have access to special services, like social services or counseling. They can interact with adults successfully in extracurricular community-based activities. Um, you know, when there's or if they're in an area with a high unemployment rate, that's a risk factor. There's what they call concentrated poverty. When there's segregation and heterogeneity of community, meaning the community doesn't have anything in common with one another, and so that creates a very disjointed community. When they have low community attachment, or schools with high failure rate or high dropout rate, excuse me, or the kid has to move a lot. And when there's media portrayal of violence within the community, these are all very strong risk factors. But a protective factor, when there's this informal network of around their neighborhood for emotional support, when there's a strong church in the community, when the schools are tied to the community. So now we're going to move on to the educational factors. And these, of course, are some important ones to me. When you have a positive school climate and the school actively seeks to enroll all students in college or some type of schooling post graduation, when the school's achievement oriented and the parents are really involved, and the role models within the school are trustworthy. When there's a high, however, on the flip side, when there's a high rate of absenteeism, there's segregation, low parental involvement, these are all risk factors that can influence criminality among juveniles. When the school has high rates of truancy or transiency, they have a lot of kids moving in and out, and then they'll end up having high rates of delinquency. When they have a lot of access to special services like mental health and remedial classes, and you have good teachers and good guidance counselors. When and the juvenile themselves should be highly bonded to the school environment, and there's this strong school bonding, and they're motivated to do well in school. When they're not, when there's low achievement, that's a risk factor. When they have low educational aspiration, that's a problem. But if they view success through education, then that's a positive influence, and that can help reduce criminality. When you have a student, though, who has low standardized test scores, they end up dropping out. They skip school 2 or more days within a month period. They have poor performance. They don't complete their homework. These are all high risk factors for delinquency, whereas protective factors, when they complete high school, when they attend school regularly, when they achieve high scores, and they have a school performance overall that's above average, when they engage in extracurricular activities. And now we're going to talk about some lifestyle factors. Daily cigarette use is a delinquency. It is a risk factor for delinquency. Or using chewing tobacco. Binge drinking is huge. Or just frequent alcohol use of marijuana. But if they don't have that early experimentation and don't use tobacco or alcohol, and they don't ride with anybody that's been drinking, these are all protective factors. When they use risk factors, when they use what we call hard drugs, LSD, PCP, cocaine, marijuana, methamphetamine. Marijuana is on the list. If they use it, so sorry. If they use it more than 6 times over a 12-month period, that is a significant risk factor. If they've driven drunk at twice or more within a year, that's a significant risk factor. Or they've ridden with someone who was drinking and driving. Some other things, just chronic truancy, runaway problems, got in trouble with police, or committed thefts. Those are all risk factors. And no contact, of course, is a protective factor. They've used weapons, again, risk factor toward delinquency. An early age of initiation, related to those behaviors. An early age means prior to age 13. And the social behavior, if they are persistently antisocial, that's a risk. Demonstrate violence and aggression. Whereas if they're highly involved in 4 key areas, or they act independently, those are good indicators that they're protected against criminality. But if they lie, cheat, steal, commit vandalism, these are a group fighting, these are all risk factors. Sensational seeking behavior, not riding with seatbelt on, little covert acts like property damage, can escalate into greater and greater delinquencies. And honestly, sexual activity is an indicator of risk factor or protective factor. If you're not in, if juveniles are not engaged in sexual activity, they tend to be protected against delinquency. Whereas if they are engaged, especially the younger they are engaged in sexual acts, the more likely they are to commit delinquent acts. Then there are some physiological things. If they have poor diet or nutrition, they don't exercise, they have early onset health problems, they don't regularly see a doctor, or they suffer from anorexia or bulimia, some type of chronic eating disorder. These are all risk factors towards delinquency. Whereas good physical health, regular checkups, exercise regularly, these are all protective factors. So I really hope that you guys learned something, and that you enjoyed it. If not, oh well. That's the information I've got, though. And it's important to understand, though, that if you think about it, those protective factors they're protective factors not just against criminality, but also against victimization. The more protected you are, you're protected not just from being a criminal or being a delinquent, but you're protected from victimization as well. So just some things to think about, and I hope you guys have a terrific week.